from the south. He's coming toward us now. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal. 330, 330, and the objects are still in the sky, although the one to the south looks like it's losing a little bit of altitude. We're turning around and heading back toward the base. The object to the south is still beaming down lights to the ground.
It was around 3 a.m. on Boxing Day, 1980, and Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston, along with Airman First Class John Burroughs, were performing a perimeter patrol of Airbase RAF Woodbridge. Sergeant Penniston looked over to nearby Rendlesham Forest and saw a strange reddish light in the sky, descending slowly into the forest like the setting of a molten sun. Penniston initially thought it was some kind of meteor, but the more he observed the object, the more he realized it was moving with intent. The slow and deliberate nature of its descent into the forest made it clear that this was some sort of aircraft. This was the height of the Cold War between Russia and America, and Penniston knew that if anyone had the capabilities to build a new kind of aircraft, it was the Russians. But this was unlike anything either man had ever seen before. Radio static crackled as Penniston radioed headquarters and was given permission to leave the base to investigate. When they reached the east gate of the base, they were joined by additional security personnel, one of whom said something that would set the tone for what came next. It didn't crash, it landed. This was just the start of what would become one of the most credible UFO encounters ever recorded. Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home of the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. It's another stormy night, so make yourself a drink and snuggle up under a warm blanket as we prepare to explore the Rendlesham Forest incident. Penniston, Burroughs and the second team left the base to investigate, and as soon as they approached the forest, they knew something was wrong. Penniston reached for his gun, then remembered they left their weapons at the base, as was protocol when leaving American jurisdiction. A deathly silence blanketed the trees. The only sound was that of the frozen ground crunching beneath their feet. They tried to radio back to base, but their radios were malfunctioning. While they could receive intermittent transmissions from the control tower, the tower couldn't hear them. Suddenly the forest erupted into life. The air was filled with the frenzied and fearful howls of animals in the nearby farms and fields. But what truly terrified the men was what sounded like the panicked screeches of a woman's screams, puncturing the stillness of the night. As the men ventured deeper into the forest, they found themselves engulfed in a strange, warm fog that buzzed like it was electrified. And as they walked on, they heard a low humming noise that was growing louder. Their radios crackled into life. It was a radio transmission reporting that another object had been sighted over neighbouring base RAF Woodbridge. Peniston ordered the second team to investigate, while he and Burrows continued to explore the forest. As Peniston and Burrows walked deeper into the forest, they saw strange lights glowing through the trees. They followed the lights to a clearing, and what they saw made them freeze in their tracks. 12 inches above the ground was a triangular metallic craft around the size of a car, hovering soundlessly. Coloured lights of red, blue and amber swirled across its hull, illuminating the strange electric mist being emitted from the craft onto the ground just inches below. Peniston reasoned this must have been the same mist they encountered earlier in the forest. Peniston found himself entranced and filled with an overwhelming urge to move closer to the object. Burrows was equally spellbound, and the two began walking slowly towards the craft. As they neared it, they experienced a bizarre sensation of moving in slow motion, as if they were walking through water, but it felt less like their movement was impeded, and more like time itself had somehow slowed down. Burrows snapped out his trance and halted a short distance away from the craft, but Peniston continued forwards. He was astonished to see there were no joins, rivets, or even panelling on the craft. It looked like one solid, seamless structure resting on 3 fixed metal legs. When he reached the craft, he placed a tentative hand on its dark, polished surface. It was smooth and warm to the touch. As his hand ran over the surface, it moved across something that had the texture of sandpaper. He looked down and saw engraved symbols that resembled ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. He gently traced his fingers over the symbols and felt subtle vibrations beneath his fingertips. All of a sudden he felt his body lock into place as a jolt ran through his body. Then everything faded to black, before a bright flash of white light filled his vision, followed by repeated sequences of ones and zeros. This continued for a few minutes, then abruptly stopped, and Peniston was once more free to move. He gasped and instinctively withdrew his hand from the craft and stepped back. He continued to sit in place, and Peniston pulled out his notebook and drew diagrams of the craft. Then, without warning, the craft rose in a flash of light and shot off through the trees towards the North Sea, before disappearing. Peniston and Burrows hurried back to base to report their experiences, and realized that what they believed was a 20-minute investigation had taken nearly 45 minutes. They had somehow lost 25 minutes of time. The local police were called shortly after 4 a.m, but by then the only lights they could see were those from the Orford Ness lighthouse, miles away on the coast. 5 hours after the encounter, Sergeant Peniston reported the events to his commander, and they agreed to revisit the site to locate any physical evidence of the sighting. What they found appeared to prove that an unidentified aircraft had indeed landed in Rendlesham Forest. Penniston led the group through the forest and to the clearing he'd had his strange encounter just hours before. Within moments of arriving, they found 3 separate impressions pressed deep into the frozen ground, as if a massive object had been resting on 3 metal legs. The impressions were in the shape of a perfect equilateral triangle. Penniston, concerned about losing the evidence, took plaster casts of the impressions, one of which would mysteriously disappear while in military storage. In addition to the indentations in the earth, the surrounding trees had broken branches some 15 feet off the ground, far beyond the reach of the local wildlife, and had scorch marks facing where the craft had landed. When the team took radiation readings, it was found that there were unusually high levels of radiation around the landing site and where the indentations were found. When they returned to base, Sergeant Penniston retired to his room for some much needed rest. But as he lay in bed, he found it impossible to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashing images of the 1s and 0s he received from touching the hieroglyphs on the craft. The more he saw the numbers, the more convinced he became that they were somehow important. Finally, he wrote them down in his notebook, and as soon as he finished, the numbers abruptly stopped appearing. It was as if whatever had been projecting the numbers into his mind was now content that the message had been delivered. He didn't know it yet, but those numbers contained a message that would open up a new and terrifying saga in the mystery of the Rendlesham incident. We'll cover that later in tonight's show, but for now, back to the story. The following night, Airman Laurie Bowens was on patrol when she saw a fiery orange light hovering at low altitude near Rendlesham Forest. She reached for her radio, but before she could report what she was seeing, her radio screeched into life. She immediately recognized the voice as that of her good friend, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. But something was very wrong. Bonnie was terrified. She was screaming something about an orange light attacking her and begging for help. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and the radio went dead. Silence once more filled the air. Laurie desperately tried to radio Bonnie back, but she didn't answer. When she looked back to the forest, the orange light was gone. Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin had been sent out with Master Sergeant Robert Ball to investigate when the orange light first appeared over Rendlesham Forest that evening. Shortly after leaving the base, the orange light started moving towards their vehicle. Tamplin tried to call back to base, but their radios had stopped working. As the object neared their car, the headlights flickered and went out, and the car slowed to a stop. It was as if something had drained all power from the vehicle. The object then shot towards the car, then hovered above the terrified airmen. A white light shot out the bottom of the object engulfing the vehicle and its occupants. Tamplin screamed out in fear as her radio came back to life, broadcasting her terror to the airbase, and she shot at the lights. The light disappeared, and as soon as it went, the headlights flickered back on, and the car started up again. While this was happening, John Burroughs woke up in a state of extreme agitation. Something told him the lights had returned. He got a ride back to base, and when he arrived, he asked a desk sergeant named O'Brien if the lights were back. When O'Brien told him about the events involving Tamplin and Ball, he knew this was just a sign of things to come. The events of that night affected Lieutenant Tamplin so badly that she suffered what was officially termed an emotional breakdown, and within days she was transferred back to the United States. The third night would capture the most compelling evidence from the Rendlesham Forest incident, and arguably some of the most important evidence in the history of UFO research. Not just because it involved the deputy base commander himself, but because the events were recorded on his handheld cassette recorder as they unfolded. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt was attending an annual awards dinner when the on-duty flight attendant burst in. Visibly distressed, he walked over to the colonel and said the two words Holt had been dreading. "It's back." Holt decided he would investigate personally. One way or another, he would get to the bottom of this. He hurriedly assembled a small team and left with Master Sergeant Bobby Ball to where it was believed the UFO had landed on the first night. And as soon as they arrived, the strange events began. It started with the on-site floodlights flickering off and on, and as the team continued to investigate the site, they found unusually high radiation levels on the side of the trees facing the clearing. It was reported the UFO had landed. At that moment, John Burroughs, back at base, awoke, and once more had an intense feeling that the lights would return, and called to request permission to join the team on site.
And two other personnel requesting to rendezvous with you at your location. Tell them negative at this time. We'll tell them when they can come out here. We don't want them out here right now.
Moments later, the nearby animals became agitated, and no sooner had this happened that the team saw the first strange light in the sky.
0148, we're hearing very strange sounds out of the farmer's barnyard animals. It's very, very active, making an awful lot of noise. Just an pigmentation. You just saw a light where? Wait, no, slow down. Where? Right at this position here, straight ahead, in between the tree. There it is again. Watch, straight ahead off my flashlight there, sir. There it is. Hey, I see it too. What is it? We don't know, sir.
They moved to the edge of the clearing to get a better look at the object, which was disappearing and reappearing. By now the animals had gone quiet, but by the time Holt realised this, the object seemed to have detected them and started to move quickly towards them. Pieces started to break off the object, and a second light appeared in the sky.
It appears to be maybe moving a little bit this way. It's brighter than it has been. It's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way. Pieces of it are shooting off. There is no doubt about it. This is weird.
The men observed the object in disbelief as it transformed itself into what resembled a huge eye in the sky, then watched in amazement as it maneuvered through the forest. All of a sudden, yet another craft appeared in the sky and flew towards the men with an impossible rate of acceleration, and then stopped right above them. Before they could react, it fired a bright white laser-like beam to the ground, no more than 10 feet from the men, and then flew off. Moments later, more lights emerged in the sky back over the forest. They were moving in a grid search formation. Whatever was piloting the objects were looking for something in the darkness of Rendlesham Forest. But whether they found it or not is just another part of the mystery. In recent years, the events surrounding Rendlesham Forest have taken on a more sinister tone, with witnesses to the events reporting that they were handed pre-written statements to sign, being advised in no uncertain terms that it would be in their best interests to sign the document and never speak of the incident again. Others reported being told to sign the Official Secrets Act, which forbade them from talking about their experiences for 30 years. Colonel Holt has recently gone on record to say that the interviews his men underwent were more like interrogations, designed to distort the narrative to fit a more acceptable, down-to-earth version of events. According to Holt, Penniston and Burroughs were of particular interest to the authorities, with both being subjected to over a dozen interviews, during which they were injected with truth serum and other drugs. In the weeks that followed, Penniston developed Meniere's disease and began suffering from PTSD, but whether this was due to the interrogations or his encounter in Rendlesham Forest is up for debate. While these revelations were shocking, there would be one final revelation that, according to some, proves beyond doubt that the events in Rendlesham Forest were extraterrestrial in nature. The numbers projected into Sergeant Penniston's mind would turn out to be binary code, and when it was finally deciphered in 2011, the code contained a message which, depending on your perspective, is absolutely terrifying. The message mentions an exploration of humanity along with the year 8100 AD and the coordinates for a number of sacred sites on Earth, including the Pyramids at Giza, the Nazca Lines in Peru, and the Temple of Apollo in Greece. Some have interpreted this to be the mass evacuation of humanity in the year 8100. Either that, or the chosen landing site for a mass planetary invasion. Fortunately, this will all take place over 6,000 years from now. The Rendlesham Forest incident is as complex as it is contradictory. So for the purposes of tonight's show, I've tried to stick to the events as reported by those present, so I can provide you with a cohesive story. However, it would be remiss of me not to talk about some of the controversies that surround this case. I will start with Colonel Holt. Firstly, the events of Rendlesham Forest weren't known about until Colonel Holt wrote a memo to his superiors on the 13th of January 1981, over 2 weeks after the events had taken place. It has come to light that these air bases were armed nuclear bases, so if there were unidentified objects in the immediate airspace of these facilities, you would expect a more urgent response. Secondly, as the years have gone by, Colonel Holt's account has become more embellished, including accusations of his men being drugged, interrogated, and accusing the British and American governments of a cover-up. The second point of controversy revolves around Sergeant Peniston. In his account, he claims to have touched the aircraft, and in turn telepathically received the binary code. However, the person with him at the time this happened, John Burroughs, never said anything about Peniston touching the aircraft in his statements, although both men agree on what they saw that night. Additionally, Peniston's accounts of that night, like that of Holt's, have become more embellished and sensational over time. There have also been questions about when Sergeant Peniston actually wrote down the code in his notebooks, with some arguing it was done many years after the fact. Although this still doesn't explain how he acquired the code in the first place. Skeptics have offered all manner of explanations, ranging from misidentified lights from the nearby lighthouse, naturally occurring celestial phenomena, and even an elaborate practical joke carried out by the British SAS. And while perhaps this could contribute to some of the reports, it's hard to believe that nearly 100 seasoned military professionals who specialise in identifying aerial phenomena all mistook a lighthouse or meteor for a manned craft of some kind, especially as many of these witnesses signed sworn affidavits testifying to what they saw. There is so much more to the Rendlesham incident than what I've been able to talk about in tonight's show, but it's likely that the truth about the Rendlesham incident will never be known. That's all from Paranormal FM. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please remember to like, share and subscribe. And be sure to join me next time.